So that our next section, up next, we have a powerful session driving into a critical link between endo-disruptive chemicals and breast cancer disparities, particularly within socially disadvantaged communities. We're honored to welcome two brilliant minds to lead this discussion. First, we have Dr. Ashley from the National Cancer Institute, whose work explores the intersection of genetics, environment, and cancer risks. Joining her will be Dr. I'm so sorry about the names. 𝐿𝐵𝐲𝐝, hopefully I got that correct, from the University of Illinois, the Urbana-Champaign, an expert in molecule mechanisms driving cancer progression and the impact of environmental exposure on women's health. Welcome to you both. And please, when you share, please share the correct spelling, pronunciation of your name. So I'm excited to hear your presentation. I look forward to joining you for question and answer a little bit later. The floor is yours. And we'll begin with Dr. Ashley.
Thank you. Can you all hear me okay? Perfect. Thank you, Pastor Rhonda. Thank you, Dr. Tete and the organizing team for this amazing event. We are really excited to be here. So good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for being here. Today, we're going to be talking about going a little bit zoom in into an example of an endocrine disrupting. We're going to be talking briefly about what are these, how they relate to breast cancer, and we're going to be sharing some findings from the laboratory. And next slide. As I mentioned, first we're going to start very generally to talk about our body. What is the endocrine system and what are the hormones? What are the endocrine disruptor chemicals and why we should care about this? We're going to talk about a very specific endocrine disrupting chemical, which is called PFA. And we're going to be talking about the link to breast cancer, especially in specific minority populations. And please send all your questions via the chat room because we're going to be answering them at the end. So without further ado, I really wanted to talk a little bit more about us and what motivates the work that we do. Before we actually talk about the science. So Zeynep, if you wanted to start.
Thank you, Dr. Tete, for the invitation to be here. So I was born and raised in Turkey to a family of just three, my mom and my dad, but I was always affected by the stories that were told of my ancestors, right? Unfortunately, the record keeping is not very good because of all the wars that happened in that region. However, one thing that stuck with me was how women's health was so delicate and so overlooked during these times of really crisis. My paternal grandma, she died during childbirth when she was delivering her fourth kid. And then my grandfather ended up marrying her sister and had 4 more kids after that. So that just tells you the cultural, at the time, the cultural background. So that made me interested in women's health, from very, small on as I started understanding these stories. And then my best friend's mother had breast cancer. That was the first time that I knew somebody that close by who was going through this disease, and how it affected their lives, how it affected her appearance after the surgery, the things that she could do. That stuck with me, and really I wanted to study breast cancer and learn more about it. Unfortunately, years later, we unfortunately lost my friend to breast cancer, metastatic breast cancer. So it just, motivates me every day that it's still not enough. We still need to do more, even though, 90% of the cases of the particular type that we are studying are manageable in the clinic. Still, estrogen receptor positive breast cancer is the type that kills a lot of women. And as we will mention, unfortunately, this disease, which is technically manageable in the clinic, is even deadlier for African American women. And that motivates me. And with that, I'll turn it over to Ashley to tell her story.
Yeah, thank you, Zeynep, for sharing that. So I was born and raised in Puerto Rico, and over there I grew up in public housing. So some people call it the projects, or just these are very highly dense populated buildings. They're very close to each other, and the culture there, people are really close to each other. However, there's not a lot of resources. There's a lot of people. So from a very young age, I actually experienced significant health disparities in my community, including limited access to healthcare, lack of education about cancer prevention. And I just saw how, my neighbors, my grandmother, my mom, my mother suffered from comorbidities and different health issues. So I'm driven by these experiences, and through research and education, my goal is to help decrease breast cancer disparities, and especially to empower communities like the one that I grew up in. So with that, I'm going to continue to the next slide. So the very, very basic question, what is our endocrine system? So I like to break out this word in two. So the word endocrine, and if you can click for the next. So endo means inside, and then the other one, and crine means secrete. So if you can, there you go. So basically the endocrine system, it's a mix of, or a group of glands and organs that are inside of our body that produce hormones. And the hormones are actually in charge of, they're little chemicals or compounds that we produce that carry messages through the blood to the different organs and tissues. And their role is essentially to tell your body what to do and when to do it. And I just want you to keep in mind, when you think of hormones, what do you think about, right? So actually hormones are key in life. They're in charge of growth, development, metabolism, reproduction, energy levels, and even response to stress and injury. And I want to keep that little bird in there so that you can remind yourself that hormones act as little messengers, carrying messages through your body. Next slide. So what are endocrine disruptors then? So EDCs, as I'm going to be calling them, endocrine disruptors, they're actually chemicals that mimic our hormones and interfering with all those biological processes that I just mentioned, and causing disease. Next slide. So think of them as these geysers, or, they're trying to kind of hijack, or, they're mimicking your hormones, but they're not telling the right message. Some of the common endocrine disrupting chemicals include PFAS, parabens, BPA, bisphenols, and phthalates. And today we're going to be focusing on PFAS. So this is one example of endocrine disrupting chemicals, PFAS, or perfluoroalkyl substances. Now you know why we call them PFAS for short. It's kind of a weird word. And they're actually used to create water repellent surfaces. So when you think of your nonstick cookware, your Teflon, stain resistant products, photography paper, firefighting foams, fast food packaging, the ones that feel very waxy, pesticides, paints. And they're actually used in many products since the 1950s. And the one bad thing with these chemicals is that they're very hard to degrade. So they persist in your body for a very long time. Next slide. So why are these important in breast cancer? So as I mentioned earlier, I mentioned that the EDCs actually interfere with your hormones. Well, in the case of breast cancer, one important hormone in the that it has a role in the development of breast cancer and in the progression of breast cancer is estrogen. And EDCs actually can interfere with estrogen. They can also interfere with many other signaling processes, other signals and messengers, as we call it. And then Zeynep is going to mention a little bit more about this. What we know drive aggressive cancers. And so we know that differences in health conditions and differences in social factors actually can affect circulating estrogen levels. And when I mention different social factors, I'm talking about, where you, work, live, play, and pray can affect your health condition and can actually affect cancer. And in general, we found that all of this as a combination can actually trigger your body to have more aggressive cancers. But this was before we started to study PFAS. So now Zeynep is going to talk a little bit more about the PFAS section. And at the end, we're going to be answering the rest of your questions.
Thank you, Ashley. Before I go into PFAS, actually, I want to mention one review article that we published with Dr. Tete and Dr. Trevino on, in general, exposure to these EDCs and how it was related to breast cancer disparities. And it's very clear that at the top of this, it's the structural and institutional inequities. It has to do with residential segregation, discrimination, marginalization. There is a big effect of this, both on how body, converts this to stress, and stress affects breast cancer biology. But also, in the second level, we have exposure to risks. So, for example, living near hazardous wayside, food, the food that's eaten and that's available in a neighborhood that people tend to consume more, as well as the personal care products that we just heard about in the first section. What we are studying is how our body is sensing all these environmental or external exposures and how it is turned into signals, unfortunately, that drive the breast tumors. As we were looking at the literature, it was quite clear that there was a huge gap in the research. Of course, as it was mentioned in the previous section, there is really lack of community engagement. The projects that were designed were clearly not designed with Black communities in mind. There were very restricted epidemiological studies, clinical trials, like participation, any kind of representation. And when we go into models to test these hypotheses in the lab, we were limited by the models that were present. So as we, study these EDCs and, try to understand how they work, we have to really consider all these limitations and, go about our studies with these limitations in mind. Next slide, please. Anyway, so as we work on these chemicals, PFAS, that Ashley mentioned, we found more and more that really they were engaging systems that were originally used by the hormones, right? So the endocrine system have a way of regulating body function. PFAS acting like hormones, but now activating different functionalities, different things that would lead to tumor formation, particularly in those organs that were controlled by the hormones, like estrogen. We would see an increase in how cells divide, how they become more from just one cell, also how the cells would go about the other organs, how they metastasize and end up surviving in these other places, the metastasis, which actually, unfortunately, is what is killing the patient. Next slide, please. So what did our studies found? So this is with one of the PFAS. There are thousands of different PFAS, but PFBS is one chemical that was more recently introduced. In 70s, as PFAS was used, by 90s, we became aware that there were some serious health effects of it. By 2000, use of PFAS was limited. But then what chemical companies did was to find other PFAS. Now they are not using the original PFAS, but they are using these PFAS alternatives, which we are finding to be as toxic and as carcinogenic. So one of these chemicals, PFBS, we found higher levels in African American women, and this was associated with higher cholesterol levels in these individuals. And this association was only in African American women, and we didn't see this in non-Hispanic white women. And I should mention, in addition to leading to cardiovascular issues, metabolic issues, high cholesterol is also linked to more aggressive type of breast cancers. And now we are studying this more in detail in the lab to see if really PFAS is leading to changes in the cholesterol metabolism and how it is leading to more aggressive types of tumors. Next, please. So now to the table that Ashley discussed earlier, we are adding PFAS and exposure to EDCs as social factors and environmental exposures that is changing how estrogens are working in our body and thus triggering the processes that would lead to cancers. Next, please. So that's great, science, we have data, but how do we use this data? For these particular chemicals, PFAS, I think the first message is being mindful of food and water sources that we use. Most of our exposure is from drinking water, and also the food that we eat. Ashley mentioned again, like fast food wrapping, right? And other items that are used in the food industry for dealing with lipid repellent properties. Also reduce exposure in everyday products. For example, switching to stainless steel instead of using Teflon pans, which actually are covered with these PFAS. Using stainless steel products might minimize the exposure to PFAS. And the other thing is spreading awareness. You heard about it, now you know. PFAS is in our drinking water, it's in the Teflon pans that you use. So tell people that that they should reduce use of these products so that they reduce, at least they can control one piece of risk that would put them in risk of developing cancers in the future. Next, please. With that, thank you for listening, and we would be happy to answer any questions that you have. And thank you again for the opportunity to present our data.
Well, thank you, Dr. Ashley and Dr. 𝐬𝐻𝑒𝑝, for the marvelous information that you've just shared with us. It's really good when you have scientists that can speak a language that we can understand on a daily basis. Because a lot of times the scientists are wrapped up in the lab and do not make it clear and plain enough for the community to understand. Because the goal of this symposium, is to prepare us to be able to take this information back to our community. So thank you again. And we will keep moving right along. But we will have questions answered at the end of our presentations. And ladies and gentlemen, I encourage you to put your questions in the chat box so that we can address them as we go along.